I'll try to do this quickly because I had scheduled for an hour of talking, and as a recovering academic, I could talk for days, but I only have 30 minutes or so. So that means that I have twice the number of slides, so I hope you're ready. In the interim, if the font is too small, if you can't read it, if you really want to know more, I'll send you the deck afterwards. My email will be on there. I think they also circulate it, so just give me a shout afterwards. You don't have to take too many notes.
And what you could do, do you want questions during the session, or do you want questions afterwards?
Let's do questions after the session, so that I can at least get the stuff out, so that everybody kind of knows what's what. And then, provided that we have enough time, we can do it that way. What's this? Thanks. So here's what we do. The basic reason why I think I know something about this games industry is for two reasons, really. One of them is I've been doing this for 12 years, both academically as a PhD researcher and a teacher at the business school in New York, as well as a commercial researcher, which focuses on a data set that we've collected over the years, working with publishers, developers, and so on, in getting digital transaction level data, combining it with consumer insights, qualitative research, and so on. And that allows us to say things like the market is this big, consumers like this about games, the trends are X, Y, and Z, and so on. So this is a little bit of a parameter overview of what we do, the countries we cover, and so on. These are some of the companies I work with. I'm sure you know some of these. So first things first, the way we define the games industry, the digital games industry, is we cover it in 6 different sections. I say this now because there's often sort of a question of methodology as well as how do you define the universe. So for us, it's very simply put, social network-based games. We're talking about Facebook, of course, that type of stuff. Mobile games, tablets go into one sector. Free-to-play MMOs, think of your League of Legends, subscription-based MMO type games, games that primarily make money through subscription revenue. Then there's digital console and digital PC type games, and that's sort of in our mind, and then working with our customers has been the best way to kind of define the industry today. And I guess also I put the link under there because I'd love to hear if there's anything missing. It's always, we try to figure out the industry in a way and using a language that makes sense for everybody. So if there's anything that you feel where we should not have put MOBAs on their MMOs or whatever, I'd love to hear from you, of course. And then the basic structure today is going to be 3 pieces. First, I'm going to give you sort of our overall landscape in terms of what's going on. Where we are and what's happening. Second is going to be the trends, where we look at the drivers of change. So now that we know what we know, how is this going to shift the industry, how is it changing anything, and so on. And then finally, I'm going to talk to you about what the opportunities or some of the questions at hand are for the games industry this year. That does not come out as beautiful as my designer thought, but here we are. So the games industry, the digital component of the games industry is, in our calculations, roughly $48.8 billion this year. That gives you an indication. The total industry will reach about $100 billion, including retail and software sales, by, I think, 2017, 2018. So already it makes up a large part. Easy to see, of course, that Asia is the big contributor here, but North America and Europe claim a big piece of the pie. Growing areas, of course, Latin America. I'm sure that there's many of you who are already working in Latin America because it's a very eager audience looking for content, and it's sort of an emerging market in its literal sense. Let's see the forecast here. So we have it at 56 in a few years. Forecasts are forecasts. We do our best, of course, to kind of see the future 3 years in advance. If you had asked me where we would be 3 years ago, that we would all be here, I probably would have gotten some of it right. It's always a little bit of an estimation. But so these are our numbers for the total universe. And the big moment that we're in, I think, the interesting historical moment of the games industry is in many ways the fact that we now are looking at a time when traditional retail publishing and retail distribution is still very, very good, right? We're in the beginning stages of the first cycle, of the lifetime cycle of the hardware sales. And so you see immediately, of course, a spike in retail sales, and it follows that very sort of traditional seasonal pattern where most of the revenues still come from the fourth quarter. If you overlay that with digital, you see that there is, you notice 2 things immediately. First is that it's a steady increase, so it's growing over time, but it lacks the seasonality, which is, I think, in many ways great. when you're talking on a high level about risk mitigation, for instance, you end up saying, well, look, we're not as dependent to get all of our marketing dollars in at a particular point because people will spend throughout the year. And I think, second to that then, the landscape now is different than it used to be a few years ago, for the simple reason that there is now a lot of companies out there that only focus on digital. And they're shaking it up, right? They're providing a degree of change that we haven't seen in the industry before. If you haven't played Candy Crush, you probably shouldn't be in the industry, I imagine. It's a game that's really taken off in a big way. It comes from a publisher that's been doing this for a long time. Eventually made it very, very big and doing really, really well. I think it's a typifying game for this time of the industry in that it's accessible and it's highly addictive and it's a lot of fun. Next one would be, say, a company like Nexon, right? So here's a Korean game company with a tremendous amount of experience and just know-how in how to do things. A title like MapleStory, coming in with 12 million monthly actives still, I think is a phenomenal number of people even today, considering how old the game is, but also because of its sort of user base, tends to skew very young. Let's see, so another one of these, the wizards from the north, Supercell, making the amount of money that they do is not a way to base your own business strategy, of course. It's akin to saying, well, the only thing you need to do to be successful is be the Beatles. In this case, don't be Supercell. They're a unique animal, but they do really, really well, coming in almost at $1 billion last year with 892 million. And then NCSoft, of course, another one of those reasons why the Asian industry is so big and doing so well. Here's a game company that does incredibly sophisticated gameplay, but has been doing this for such a long time. If you think about it, for instance, that one of their biggest titles is Lineage 1. For those of you who've played it, it's been around since 1997, so do the math, it's 17 years. Still making top dollar, making lots of money, and they're sort of experts at keeping people in the game. So we then expressed this in some numbers, and again, I'll send you the slides afterwards if you want. These are our year-to-date numbers, so this is up to and including September. You see League of Legends coming in at just shy of $1 billion. We have it at 1.2 or 1.4 for the remainder of the year, claiming roughly 12% of the free-to-play MMO, of the MMO market share. But still in there on a number 4 spot, you have Activision with World of Warcraft. Again, MapleStory, even though it's old, it's still doing really, really well. And it's steady at least. The top climbers, and this is different from, say, the mobile games industry, where the charts tend to be a little frozen. In the MMO space, you see a little bit more volatility in the market. And then, of course, even though that they're in the same space, a League of Legends versus a Dota really kind of has a different sense of size between them. I would say for roughly every 10 players you have in League of Legends, you have 1 Dota player. So that gives you an indication of how big and how broad, but also how profitable this can be. Newcomer, I would say, is Hearthstone. It's kind of a surprising title because for the longest time, people didn't think that card-based gameplay would be a big thing. And so we would argue against this and we say, look, you have to do this. And I'm very, very happy to say that it turns out we're right. They're doing really, really well, and they're doing a good job in monetizing this as well. So that's sort of the landscape of major titles, major markets, but it's really sort of on a high level changing. The drivers behind all this tend to be the following. And this is broken out by platform. When we look, for instance, at the mobile games industry, you see that there's a tremendous amount of buzz and information out there in terms of how big is it, what can we expect. We have it at about 21 billion for the year, continuing to go up, mostly because it's a very accessible platform, right? So you have to think, for instance, at the fact that markets like China are just getting started in this, right? It's an extremely large market. Monetizes not as well as, say, Western or developed markets, if you will. But at the same time, they just make up for in sheer volume. And then here's kind of the tricky part. If you look at the actual spending per user and then compare it to the actual cost to get that user, you see a discrepancy emerging. So for those of you in the back, the blue line is the cost per install. The purple is the average spending. And it's, in other words, what we're doing is, despite all this innovation, and their sort of transition to digital platforms, we now have a situation where mobile gaming is returning to what has been already known in the retail-based business, that it costs a lot of money to market to these people successfully and kind of figure out how to get people in the game, monetize and retain them. And so as a result, you see companies like Supercell and King sort of employing different, more traditional marketing channels, offline marketing channels, billboards, commercials, and TV, because they're trying to figure out how do we address the largest possible market and how do we get those people to know about our game and go play it. And so that's really a big sort of the moment for mobile games that they're looking at now, right? There's tremendous growth. China's coming online. India's coming online as owners of feature phones are upgrading to smartphones. So you can imagine that that's going to be a big shift in the market. But at the same time, the cost of doing this is now tremendously different, say, a few years ago. And then there's this lady. I'm always reminded of this. And so as say, part of my time I spent teaching, you'll talk to students and say, well, what do you know about the games industry? And they'll know Candy Crush. And as of a few months, they also know about Kim Kardashian. So here is someone that's been spending her entire life trying to monetize her image, build a brand, make perfume, make videos about working out, but none of it actually adds up to nearly as much as the game that they released, right? So this game made 51 million off the top of my head in 4 months, developed by Glue, and the backstory is very simple, right? So this is a sort of, think of a Farmville type version of celebrity life. You buy in-game items. It's all about tweeting and being popular and so on, hanging out with celebrities. And somehow, this managed to make a lot of money. And this is a game that they originally made without Kim Kardashian, then took it off the market, and then released it with, her image all over it, with her voice in the game, and it all of a sudden just went nuts. You see one of the competitors for Glue is a company called Gameloft. Same thing. So here we have, heavily licensed content. Spider-Man Unlimited managed to get 20 million downloads in the first 30 days. So in other words, to offset their marketing expense, to really get by the discovery issue, if you will, mobile game companies managed to figure out how to do that by just licensing things. Of course, and there's two key notes here. One of them is, on the one hand, you have to be the kind of developer that can actually command that kind of license. People always want their license to be protected. They don't want you to mess around with their IP. And at the same time, of course, you have to come up with like a full strategy. You can't. So in the case of Kim Kardashian, the game mechanics actually suit the celebrity personality. So in other words, the games that you see on the mobile platform right now that really are going to sort of break the mold and drive change in the market are the ones that can actually leverage this kind of work. So social gaming, and that's a good segue too from Glue. So Glue recently announced that after mobile, they're now pushing the game out on social platforms. That market is actually really interesting, right? So we all know the story of Zynga, how Farmville kind of came and then started to decline, and how people are trying to figure out how to capture that market today. It's still doing pretty well overall. You see in a market like North America, you see both. You see revenue increasing even though audience is declining, which is another way of saying the people that used to play it but didn't spend are moving on, but the people are dedicated, they stay on. And so that improves average spending overall. But then you see Latin America and Asia where you see both of them growing. Latin America used to be much more of a growth market. It's still pretty good, but there's a point of saturation that they'll probably hit in the next 12 to 18 months. And so you see that represented sort of in the overall audience and revenue figures for this year. I think at 8.7 billion worldwide, it's a pretty steady market. It's not, mobile, which is roughly 3 times as large, but it's still a very profitable market if you can capture it. And so, as I said, so the average spending per user goes up. That's how the North American market seems to do it. But then, of course, focusing on, say, China, or even Brazil, there we see Orchid folding, having been totally beaten by Facebook, and it's starting to, at the same time, while that's all transitioning, there's also sort of a stagnation in the overall audience. Next runner-up is then free-to-play MMOs. It's hard to find an article that doesn't say free-to-play is growing. It seems to be like that's the magical unicorn that everybody's been waiting for, but it's also, of course, a very difficult thing to build for. If you compare it to its sort of predecessor or subscription-based gaming, if you will, you see that there is a wildly different trend, right? So year over year, it's growing faster. It's also operating at a much larger volume. We're talking, 1 to 4 ratio in terms of revenues worldwide. For every single subscription player, you have 11 free-to-play MMO players. Of course, this has a lot to do with conversion rates. A lot of them are non-spending, but it gives you a sense of the audience that you have to build up to really do this well. And then finally, it's 1.5 times, 15 times larger in terms of audience. And again, so this puts a lot of pressure on, say, your infrastructure, your back-end technology, and so on, your customer support. So even though you think, well, there's a huge market there, you're dealing with such a volume that you have to account for and plan for all this. But that said, so then very quickly the conversation turns towards, well, doesn't this mean that subscription MMOs are, a thing of the past? It's going to totally decline? Well, no. The reason is very simply put is that there's a huge amount of loyalty in all of this, right? So you have here the actual revenue, the blue line is the subscriber base as reported by Activision. What was it, 2 weeks ago, they reported that there was actually a jump of 600,000 subscribers in their game in the run-up to the new release of their expansion pack called Warlords of Draenor. And really what drives a lot of this is, of course, the user loyalty. They retain, they stay in the game very long because they have a strong social network or a tie to the game. And there's an ongoing sort of expansion release, which excites them and keeps them playing. PC, in my mind, this is always a tricky one. For years, as an analyst, I end up having these conversations with other analysts over drinks, and it's, well, PC business is doomed, it's going nowhere. Yeah, that's not what our data says. In fact, it keeps growing. A lot of it has to do, of course, that these markets like North America and Europe, they drive a lot of this, right? So people own their PC, they want to have their games, and they continue to download them. I think a company like Steam, or Valve with its Steam platform, has done really well in making things available and distributing really efficiently. And of course, you'll monetize that audience at the same time. So when you look on a worldwide basis on the revenue distribution, you see that both the North American and European market make up for most of it. And more interesting than that, perhaps, is the notion that customers seem to be accustomed to or transitioning to this mindset of not just spending one time on a single purchase, but spending one time on a single purchase and then continuing to buy expansion packs, right? So the actual money spent on additional content now sort of matches that of first purchases. And that's really, I think, an interesting transition for the PC-based games industry. Now you have to plan your sales cycle in a very, very different way. Now you have to end up thinking about, as we market it, as we go out there and launch the game, what do we have 3 months out, and when do we actually release that next piece of content? And then on the distribution end, of course, I think there's a lot of innovation happening. As much as I personally like Steam, of course, it's always a good thing to be critical of a company, but in this case, I think they got it right. Setting up a tool that allows people to really find games and sort of connecting with the content that's relevant for them, in this sort of sea of available titles, you want to be able to, reach your consumer with relevant content and vice versa, right? So people don't want to be facing titles that are totally uninteresting to them. And so having it available at this stage in the game, compared to, say, mobile games, which tend to suffer much more so from discovery issues, we end up having, a strong contender sort of solving this problem. And then, of course, there is the recent acquisition by Microsoft of Mojang Studios. A large number of people that play Minecraft, they're on PCs, right? So they're sitting out there building away. So we can get into the rhetoric of whether or not Minecraft is actually a game or not. But I think you have to take it from a larger perspective and say, well, people are engaging with a synthetic universe, with a digital content of sort, and they make premium purchases as opposed to virtual goods. This all lives on the PC platform, and it was valued at $2.5 billion. I think it accounts for something. Finally then, digital console. And I realize that I'm running a lot of numbers very quickly by. It's because for the sake of time. This is a more interesting one for the bigger publishers, I would say. So now that we're about a year and a half into the new console cycle, you see a lot of people asking sort of like, okay, are we now finally transitioning to a model where people will buy things and download them digitally straight onto their hard drives on their consoles at home? And we see that exactly happening. So it continually grows. It currently accounts for, say, 10 to 15% of revenues for major publishers. So when EA released its earnings yesterday, they're already claiming, like, look, we're doing well because of digital distribution on consoles. That's making up a tremendous amount of our revenues, and it continues to grow. The expectation is that will, call it roughly double by this time next year, purely because, publishers are now figuring this out, hardware is now figuring this out, and it's working for everybody. And then, overall, you can see sort of the improvement year over year. So you take the same quarter last year, and you see an increase in conversion, so the number of people that actually end up spending, and you see an increase in the per player spending. So in other words, people are slowly noticing that there is a shift in how consumers deal with digital content, whereas previously it was just single discs that you would buy, stick in your machine. Now slowly people and the industry are sort of getting hip to the idea that we could do this in a digital format, and it's starting to actually make some money here. So here's the question. So there's always two reasons why people look at digital console. They say, well, does it actually improve margins? Like, who are the big publishers? And they're going to, does this mean that we now don't have to deal with the retailers anymore? It all very much depends still. I mean, implied in that sort of line of thinking is the idea that, well, will retail be out of business anytime soon? The answer is probably no. And for the simple reason that people go to stores, even though, you can buy anything online. Walking through Paris last night, or where I live in New York, people love having a retail experience. At the same time, so that's on the consumer side. There's an inertia there, right? So consumers are not going to switch from retail to digital overnight. It's going to take decades, if not a lot longer. At the same time, publishers aren't really, that agile just yet. So one of my favorites, Grand Theft Auto 5, came out, had Grand Theft Auto, had an online component, and promised a lot of downloadable content, of which we've seen nothing so far. And that's kind of an interesting thing. You say, well, here's this opportunity for major publishers. What are they waiting for, right? So as I'm sure they'll be quizzed on this later this week, when Take-Two releases its earnings, what's the deal? Like, why are we waiting for so long to get additional content? And only yesterday, they sort of informally released this statement saying, oh, just hold on to next year, it's going to be great, even though it's been out for over a year. So that sort of summarizes in super speed format, so the overall market and its drivers. The next step then is sort of like, okay, where do we head next, right? So what's ahead of us? So I'm sure most of you will know this anecdotal evidence of Riot selling out the Staples Center in Los Angeles for its esports championship in an hour, right? Thousands of people paying money for a ticket. A few weeks ago, we also had the same situation in Madison Square Garden. So me and my team, we actually went out there, took a bunch of pictures. It's fascinating, this idea that people will go to a real-life performance of their favorite gamers and go watch this stuff, right? So as we all sort of prime our minds towards thinking about digital games, digital distribution, and all the efficiencies and all that kind of stuff, people seem to be driven in a different direction at the same time by saying, look, I want to actually experience this with thousands of people who also like these games. So, what that really means, of course, in terms of industry, you start to see an increase in price money. You start to see companies put a tremendous amount of money or a growing amount of money behind sponsoring these things. They're trying to get people, of course, excited by raising the price pools. And you start seeing a tremendous number of people watching this stuff. So they go watch people play competitive gaming in real life, but they also do it online. It gives you, sort of a rough sketch of what's to follow by thinking about, okay, once we now have this set of eyeballs out there, which largely consists of young, affluent, tech-savvy users, that's very exciting for brands, advertisers, and so on. And so all of a sudden, you start to see a lot of sponsors, like a Coca-Cola, spending a tremendous amount of money on this. Amazon acquiring Twitch for close to $1 billion. all of a sudden, like, there's now this validation moment where we say, well, you know, this is actually worth something. We should look into this more. Again, there is a point of inertia. Currently, the market is still very fragmented. So yes, sure, while brands are interested, at the same time, they're not sure how to fit this into their usual way of doing business and when it comes to advertising and sponsorships. Second point is, you know, what's probably known to some of you in the last couple of weeks, this thing called Gamergate. I think as an academic, it's a fascinating conversation. You know, this idea of both journalistic ethics when it comes to game reviews, as well as, you know, the gender representation and sexuality in games. I will save you my theories on that for now. Suffice to say that, and this is one of the sort of most vocal people in that conversation, Anita Sarkeesian, you know, the notion that all of a sudden now games have become this mainstream form of entertainment inevitably is going to, you know, ruffle some feathers. Inevitably, we're going to run into a few situations where, you know, the content that's out there is not going to match the demands of the market. And so there's a really lively, to put it mildly, a very lively discussion going on about this right now. I think it's fascinating, and I think it's an opportunity to kind of think of this market as an industry and say, well, where we are now in the sort of evolution of the games industry as an entertainment medium is a moment where we have to kind of include more players, right? We can no longer just rely on this age-old stereotype of some socially awkward kid in the basement playing a shooter game. It is a much more diverse audience, and I think it needs to be met. So fortunately, of course, if you look in the history of the games industry, it's been very, very effective and very, very strong in taking initiative and leadership in incorporating more groups and so on. So for me, the recent conversation about Gamergate, if you will, really culminates in the moment of like, this is another one of those situations where the games industry will prove itself better, in the same way that it did by self-regulating, by imposing ratings and so on. And so that's really the sort of larger perspective here for me. And then finally, of course, on the platform side, we have some innovation as well. You know, it's hard to miss when Facebook buys a company for $2 billion after meeting them 3 days earlier on a totally, entirely new, well, it's not new in terms of concept, but in an entirely new sort of way of experiencing games. You know, I'll run through the timeline pretty quickly here because most of you can't read it in the back. But so suffice to say, in a very short period of time, we've been hearing a lot of stuff about the Oculus Rift. Samsung Gear came out. Google is making acquisitions left and right. So there seems to be a lot of buzz around this notion of like, well, look, we can finally enter into this interactive super universe where everything is going to be lifelike. We're going to be playing all these fantastic new games. You know, Oculus Rift is sending out 120 million development kits and so on. What's next? What's to come after this? Well, and that's where I would like to raise some questions, and that might lead into a discussion after this, is to say, well, you know, does it really deliver on this? Does it really mean that now we're going to be seeing the games industry in a tremendously new light? Is it going to shift the model? So when Samsung published its Gear a few weeks ago, you know, once you start talking to people out there, they say, well, this is great, right? This is a nice piece of hardware. It's going to be this new platform. But for major publishers to really carry the torch, to really move this forward, they need an install base, right? If you remember a year and a half, we were all talking about how micro consoles were going to totally put people out of business left and right. You know, without a large enough footprint, it doesn't really make sense. And so that's really what you hear the major companies out there saying. Right? They say, well, look, unless we have 1 million or so units, as informal as that number may be, you know, it's not interesting to them. Right? They really need an install base that's large enough for everybody to justify the investment that goes into the high cost of development of virtual reality games. And so, you know, very quickly, of course, then Oculus Rift goes, well, we'll pay for the thing, right? And Samsung goes, well, we'll have all this original programming. But immediately, sort of on the end of that thought, when you talk to people, is, well, really what seems to be the big type of content that's going to make this a successful platform is, you know, movies, right? It has nothing to do with games. And for the very, you know, reason that Zelnick, for instance, points out, interactive entertainment is exactly that. It allows you to agency and stuff. While the content that's being pushed right now is very much a very passive type of content. It's spectacular movies, and you can look all around, but you can't actually make decisions in the universe just yet. So, you know, I just want to put some critical notes when it comes to sort of the, excitement and enthusiasm around virtual reality and say, well, let's see if that actually pays off. Let's see if there's actually going to be big developers of content that are going to drive this in a way that's totally innovative and new. For now, we'll see. I think there's going to be a few more years before this takes off. So, as a quick highlights, for those of you who want to really narrow it down, digital games will continue to grow. We see the traditional publishers trying to come to grasp with this. Then there's, of course, the digital-only publishers that are just taking a big run with this, doing really, really well, have been successful at jumping into the hole. We see a shift in gamer audiences. People are much more diverse. All of a sudden, the term gamer is on the same level as the term reader or viewer. It's no longer a specific demographic. And from what we can tell, that the real innovation will, of course, always come from the content side, where we have fantastic experiences for users, but really increasingly so comes from the business side, right? How do we build? How do we distribute? How do we curate? How do we get user-generated content off the ground? How do we license? All those type of questions. So we'll be looking for innovation, not just on the consumer side and the end product, but also on the operations of companies as we move forward. So with that, thanks. That wasn't bad for 60 minutes of material.
That was very good. So I'm sure there's plenty of questions after all that. Raise your hands and I'll give you the microphone. Don't be shy. Hey, here we go.
So Joost, thank you very much. Great presentation.
So,
on that last point about virtual reality, you didn't bring up Magic Leap and their $500 million raise. Can you give us some information about that, and what was the valuation?
what the valuation was of that? Well, I mean, so I think people are placing their bets.
Billions, right? I mean, a couple billion, right?
Right, but so, here's the big distractor is always, look, here's a bunch of companies spending big early on in the development or in the moment when these things start to take hold. I think it's an interesting moment, but it's a moment we've seen before. What ends up happening is that people spend a lot of money now because they don't want to miss out. Right? I think Twitch was an interesting example in parallel with this. It's going to be Google. It's going to be Google. It has to be Google. Oh my God, it's Amazon that actually buys them. What happened? And I think that companies like Facebook has told it, has stated when they bought the thing, when they bought Oculus, this is a 5-year plan. This is a 10-year plan. We're going to see this come back to us, but we need to make investments now. So, I think the money and the numbers behind it is kind of irrelevant. It's people are trying to buy real estate in a market that they think will be more valuable later.
Hi. I have a question about companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon are not in video game industry right now, but they're investing in it. Do you think it's more like to have a step in something that will work later, or is it like they want to do something with it later?
Sorry, so the way that they are looking at virtual reality?
Yeah, and why do they invest?
Well, so they're, of course, thinking of this as a platform play, right? If you can get 100 million people to use your device as opposed to some other guy's device, that gives you access to those users. So there's a nightmare scenario here where Facebook will just make you this super targeted set of eyeballs in a virtual universe where we can both be watching the same tennis game, which I think is a very boring way of using virtual reality. But so let's say we're watching the same tennis game and we get targeted ads and we get the same. So now my sort of fantasy universe that I am participating in, which I spend lots of money on, is now just riddled with advertising. So, but that's the nature of these companies, right? So that's a Facebook, so that's a nightmare scenario, granted. Amazon will probably do the same thing. They say, well, we want this to be something that allows us also to use behavioral information and put it back out there as something that people can then spend money on. But so I don't want to call it a funnel, but it's more of a platform strategy. And so that's what I suspect will happen in the next few years.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any takers?
All right. So I'm curious, actually. So how many of you guys are on the developer side? All right. So that means everybody else is publishers? So, you know, when you guys look at it, you know, and I'll raise a question to you guys then. If you see these shifts in platforms, you know, it went from social to mobile very quickly, right? How do you guys deal with it? And so as a developer, like how do you actually figure out early on in your development cycle, you know, what we need to only do tablets? Like how do you make those decisions? Because it seems like there's, you know, across the spectrum, not just digital, but across the spectrum of entertainment, that there's a lot going on. But so what's the best way to do that? And I'm wondering, are there any developers in the room that can speak to that? So is everybody just looking at mobile and Android now, or is that? How many of you developing for Android? Oh my God, why not?
I'll jump in. I back developers. And one of the issues that we're looking at is the gap in the PC digital financing problem. The problem of financing games that are in a middle market, middle budget that traditional publishers are not going to look at because or are not well suited. And so one of the big preoccupations there is picking the best way to acquiring marketing skills so that you can deal without a traditional publisher, but also figuring out the what's the best platform, Steam delivery platform, you know, others. I mean, you mentioned how much you like Steam, and I think, you know, Steam has kind of got a monopoly in many ways on delivery of that type of product. So, I mean, that's in terms of figuring it out. Maybe you can speak to: do you see Steam competitors, and what do you do in that middle?
Oh, there's tons of Steam competitors. I mean, you have Good Old Games, Gamersgate, and so on. So Gamersgate is a distribution platform. Gamergate is a whole other thing. Gamersgate as a distribution platform focuses on more of a long tail strategy, for instance, right? Where Steam has very aggressive sales. You know, they tend to be much more like trying to sell titles that have been out for a while to fans, right? So they do well with things like, you know, civilization type games, for the sheer reason that that's their audience. So that you can carve out as a platform and as a publisher and a developer, consequently, then a particular niche, a particular audience. So one of the affordances, I would say, of digital gaming is that you now build enough of an audience base worldwide because you're no longer attached to a physical infrastructure to reach a number of users that actually sustain your business financially. So that's just in terms of headcount. And I think over time, it allows you to also do it where you don't have to make all your money in the first 3 weeks like you do at retail, right? That's the big, you know, nightmare of a publisher behind, say, a Destiny or Grand Theft Auto, is that they don't make their money back within 2-3 weeks of launch. You can now have a much longer release cycle and make money that way. I mean, PC showed exactly that, right? People spend more money on additional content than they do on the actual purchase. So that's sort of my take on it. Then, who is focuses exclusively on the European market? All right, that's not too many. So everybody else is from like North America? Eastern Europe, Russia? I don't know. Let's break up Europe into a big. And the rest of you are from space. That's great. I'm always curious because I'm trying to figure out what the questions are. The questions I find tend to be very much localized, right? I mean, you're talking, say, a Riot or a Tencent. You know, when they roll out, it's not just about translating the games, but it's also about setting up infrastructure and so on. So I'm always curious what your experiences are there. So if you're not from, mostly from Europe or the US, do you guys focus on the Latin American market at all? Is that a big thing on the radar? Or is it really just mostly mobile and simple low-end game? No? Oh, wow. You guys have been very, very forthcoming with the information. All right, so then let's wrap this party. Any other questions? I'll be happy to talk one-on-one.
Thank you for your super speed research. You said a lot about the online gaming, yeah? But my question is about the most lucrative part of online gaming, I mean social casino games.
Yes.
Yeah, do you have any data about it, any forecast, any scoop for us?
Yes, yes, and yes. So the data is very simply put. The average spending on social is $20-25 a month. Social casino, if you enter all the genres in a big bucket, it's 3 times that. So it's about $60 a month. The forecast would be that it continues to grow steadily so in the developed markets. And by developed, I don't mean economically developed. I mean they are more mature because there's been companies out there have been able to do business there longer. But a lot of those companies now looking at Asia Pacific. And so, you know, the scoop, I would say, without ruining anybody's fun, is the big companies are all looking to continue their growth. And so they're all looking, okay, what else is there outside of North America, Europe, and Latin America? So they're all going east. And that's the fun part, because east is, you know, it's a fortress. It's in China, it's illegal.
Well, yeah, China is illegal. Yeah.
Right, so then it's like, well, look at all those users, but we can't actually serve them anything. So there's ways around it, right? And so you have game companies, they don't sell you currency or coins that you can use to play slots or poker. They will sell you drinks. So you buy a digital drink, and with it comes whatever, a handful of coins. So there's a lot of creativity in ways of, you know, offering people up card-based games, slot-based games, or chance-based games without actually breaking any of the rules.
So do you think that poker will be still #1, or maybe slots, bingo?
I would say in the West, yeah, right? So slots is the biggest one. Poker is also a very big one, of course. In the East, I think it's more like a mahjong or a poker-based, like Texas Hold'em type games. And slots are a little bit further down the line.
Where can I find some more detail about it? In the report? Yeah.
Yeah, give me a call.
Thank
We
you
do a
very
lot of
much.
this stuff. We've been working with most of the major guys. Because it's an interesting, you know, I'll put on my academic hat for a second and say, if you go to Vegas, and if you haven't, you should go to Vegas. Here is gameplay around which an entire environment was designed specifically to facilitate gameplay, right? Mm-hmm. So everybody's nice, you can smoke indoors. It's the only place in the US where you can smoke indoors. You know, you get free drinks as you play and so on. So it's geared towards getting people at the table to spend money and so on. Mm-hmm. So it's a very holistic notion of design. I think that's where we're headed with a lot of social casino stuff as well, is that it's, you know, not just about, okay, give me some of your money and you can play a little bit. It's more about offering people a more of a unique and sort of, you know, engulfing experience, if you will.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, that was it. Thanks, guys.